When a single father stops to help a stranded woman on a dark highway, he has no idea she's the billionaire who broke his heart 20 years ago. Or that the daughter sitting in his back seat might be their lost child. Will one chance encounter destroy the only family he's ever known, or give them all a second chance at the love they thought was gone forever? Stay with us until the very end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment below with your city so we can see how far our story has traveled across the world. The rain hammered against Ethan Carter's windshield like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments before being swept away by wipers that had seen better days. The old Honda's engine coughed and wheezed as it climbed the winding mountain road. But Ethan patted the dashboard affectionately. This car had been his faithful companion through 7 years of single fatherhood, and tonight was no different. "Daddy, why are we going so slow?" Sophie's voice piped up from the back seat, her 7-year-old impatience cutting through the rhythmic drumming of rain. In the rearview mirror, Ethan could see her pressing her nose against the window, watching the storm rage outside with the fearless curiosity that never failed to amaze him. "Because the roads are slippery, sweetheart," Ethan replied, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as they rounded another curve. "We want to make sure we get home safe to Mrs. Henderson, don't we?" The elderly babysitter was probably pacing the floor right now, worried sick about them being out so late. But Ethan's construction job at the new shopping center had run over again, and by the time he'd picked Sophie up from after-school care, the storm had already begun its assault on the mountain highway that connected their small town to the city. "Look, Daddy," Sophie suddenly exclaimed, pointing ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. "There's a car." Ethan squinted through the downpour and felt his heart skip a beat. About 50 yards ahead, a sleek silver vehicle sat motionless on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights blinking like a distress signal in the darkness. Steam or smoke, he couldn't tell which, rose from beneath the hood, barely visible in the storm. His first instinct was to keep driving. This stretch of highway was notorious for its isolation, and with Sophie in the car, his protective instincts screamed at him to mind his own business. But as they drew closer, Ethan could make out a figure standing beside the disabled vehicle, a woman soaked to the bone, her arms wrapped around herself as she shivered in the rain. "We have to help her, Daddy," Sophie said, her voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone that children used when stating the obvious. "She's all alone in the rain." Ethan's foot hovered over the accelerator for a moment longer, torn between caution and compassion. Then he caught sight of the woman's face in his headlights, pale, desperate, and utterly vulnerable, and the decision made itself. "You're right, baby girl," he murmured, pulling over behind the stranded car. "We can't just leave her out here." As Ethan stepped out into the storm, the rain immediately soaked through his worn flannel shirt and work jeans. The woman looked up as he approached, and even through the curtain of water streaming down her face, he could see the relief flood her features. "Thank God," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I thought no one would stop." "What seems to be the problem?" Ethan called out, raising his voice to be heard over the wind and rain. As he got closer, he noticed details that didn't quite fit together. The woman's clothes were expensive designer labels that probably cost more than his monthly rent. But she was completely alone on this desolate stretch of highway, with no cell phone in sight. "I don't know," she replied, pushing wet strands of dark hair from her face. "The engine just started making this awful noise, and then steam started pouring out. I barely managed to pull over before it died completely." Ethan nodded, already moving toward the front of her car. "Pop the hood, I'll take a look." As the hood lifted, a cloud of steam billowed out, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of overheated coolant. Ethan peered into the engine bay using the flashlight app on his phone to illuminate the problem. It didn't take long to spot the issue. A radiator hose had burst, sending coolant spraying everywhere. Well, the good news is it's fixable, he announced, turning back to the woman. The bad news is you're not going anywhere tonight. That radiator hose is blown, and even if I had a replacement with me, you've lost too much coolant to drive safely. The woman's face crumpled with despair. Oh God, what am I going to do? I have to get home. There's a meeting tomorrow morning that could… She stopped herself, as if realizing she was saying too much to a stranger. Hey, it's okay, Ethan said gently, recognizing the edge of panic in her voice. Do you have someone you can call, family, a friend? She shook her head, water droplets flying from her hair. My phone died hours ago, and there's no one. The admission seemed to pain her more than the cold rain. Ethan felt Sophie's presence before he saw her. Despite his instructions to stay in the car, his daughter had climbed out and was now standing beside him, her small frame dwarfed by her bright yellow raincoat. Sophie, what did I tell you about? She's crying, Daddy. Sophie interrupted, her young voice filled with concern as she looked up at the stranded woman. We can't leave someone who's crying alone in the rain. The woman knelt down to Sophie's level, her expensive clothes soaking up muddy water from the road. You're very sweet, little one. What's your name? Sophie Carter, the girl replied with the confidence that only children possessed. And this is my daddy, Ethan. He's really good at fixing things. Sophie Carter, the woman repeated softly, as if testing the name on her tongue. Something flickered across her fade, a shadow of recognition or memory that was gone too quickly for Ethan to interpret. What's your name? Sophie asked with typical childhood directness. The woman hesitated for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine expression Ethan had seen from her. Victoria. My name is Victoria. That's a pretty name, Sophie announced. Like a princess. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced up at Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite a princess, I'm afraid. Ethan made a decision that would change all their lives, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. Look, Victoria, we can't leave you stranded out here. The nearest town is 15 miles back, and there's no telling when another car might come along in this weather. Why don't you come with us? I can bring you back in the morning with the parts to fix your car. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and in the intermittent glow of the lightning, Ethan caught glimpses of something in her eyes. Surprise, gratitude, and something else. Something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. I couldn't impose like that, she began, but Sophie was already taking her hand. You have to come with us, Sophie declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Daddy makes the best hot chocolate in the whole world, and Mrs. Henderson is probably making cookies right now because she always does when it storms. Victoria looked down at Sophie, then back at Ethan, and something in her expression cracked open. If you're sure it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all, Ethan said, surprised by how much he meant it. Come on, let's get out of this rain. As they made their way back to Ethan's car, Victoria grabbed a small overnight bag from her vehicle. Ethan couldn't help but notice how she moved with a practiced elegance that spoke of boardrooms and first-class flights so different from the practical efficiency of his own world. The drive back to town was filled with Sophie's chatter about school, her friends, and her upcoming birthday party. Victoria listened with an attention that seemed to surprise even her, asking questions about Sophie's favorite subjects and hobbies with genuine interest. I love art class the most, Sophie was explaining from her car seat. Miss Peterson says I'm really good at drawing faces. I can draw you a picture if you want, Victoria. I would like that very much, Victoria replied, her voice softer than it had been on the highway. She turned slightly in the passenger seat to look at Sophie, and Ethan caught her profile in the dashboard lights. There was something hauntingly familiar about the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, but he couldn't place it. Do you have any kids, Victoria? Sophie asked with the innocent directness that often made adults uncomfortable. Victoria's breath caught audibly, and her hand moved to rest against her chest, as if something hurt there. No, she said quietly. No, I don't have any children. That's too bad, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Kids are really fun. You could borrow me sometimes if you want. I'm very well behaved. This drew a genuine laugh from Victoria, though Ethan thought he heard tears in it. That's very generous of you, Sophie. I might just take you up on that offer. As they pulled into the driveway of Ethan's modest two-bedroom house, the porch light cast a warm yellow glow through the rain. Mrs. Lascelles Henderson's silhouette appeared in the front window, and Ethan could practically feel her relief through the glass. "Home, sweet home," he announced, turning off the engine. The sudden silence felt profound after hours of rain and road noise. Victoria stared at the small house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, and Ethan felt a familiar stab of self-consciousness. He worked hard to provide for Sophie, but their home was a far cry from the wealthy neighborhoods where someone wearing designer clothes in a storm probably lived. "It's perfect," Victoria said softly, and something in her tone made Ethan look at her more closely. She wasn't being polite, she meant it. "It looks like a real home." Before Ethan could ask what she meant by that, the front door burst open and Mrs. Henderson came rushing out with umbrellas, her gray hair pinned back severely, but her face warm with concern. "Ethan Carter, I've been worried sick," she scolded, though her relief was evident. "The storm's been getting worse, and when you didn't call—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Victoria. "Oh my." "Mrs. Henderson, this is Victoria," Ethan explained as they hurried toward the house. "Her car broke down on the highway. I told her she could stay the night." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, but her expression remained welcoming. After 65 years of life and 30 years of babysitting, very little surprised her anymore. "Well, of course, dear," she said to Victoria, ushering them all inside. "Any friend of Ethan's is welcome here. You must be frozen to the bone. I'll put on some tea." The warmth of the house enveloped them like a hug. It wasn't much mismatched furniture walls that needed painting, and Sophie's artwork covering every available surface, but it was undeniably a home filled with love. Victoria stood in the small entryway, dripping water onto the worn hardwood floors, and looked around with an expression of wonder that puzzled Ethan. It was as if she'd never seen a lived-in home before. "I'll get you some dry clothes," Ethan offered, already heading toward the stairs. "They might be a little big, but at least they're warm." "That's very kind," Victoria murmured. Her attention caught by a gallery of Sophie's drawings taped to the refrigerator. She moved closer, studying each one with the intensity of someone viewing priceless art. "That one's my daddy," Sophie announced proudly, pointing to a stick figure with dark hair and a huge smile. "And that's me on my bike. And this one is my mommy in heaven." Victoria's breath caught again, and she stared at the drawing, a simple sketch of a woman with long hair and a flowing dress surrounded by clouds and stars. "Your mommy is in heaven?" Victoria asked gently, kneeling down to Sophie's level. Sophie nodded solemnly. "She went there when I was born. But Daddy says she watches over me all the time, and that's why I'm so brave." Ethan paused on the stairs, his throat tightening, as it always did when Sophie talked about her mother. The truth was more complicated than his 7-year-old could understand. Sophie was adopted, and he'd been raising her alone since she was 6 months old. Her birth mother hadn't died. She'd simply vanished, leaving only a note saying she couldn't keep her baby. "I'm sure she does watch over you," Victoria said softly, reaching out to touch Sophie's cheek with surprising tenderness. "You're a very special little girl." There was something in Victoria's tone, something raw and painful, that made Ethan study her more carefully. The way she looked at Sophie, the careful distance she maintained, despite her obvious affection, it reminded him of someone trying not to get too attached to something they couldn't have. "Victoria, are you okay?" he asked, descending the stairs. She straightened quickly, smoothing her wet hair back from her face. "Yes, of course. Just tired. It's been a long day." Mrs. Henderson bustled into the room carrying a tray with steaming mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of fresh oatmeal cookies. "Here we are," she announced. "Nothing like chocolate and cookies to warm you up on a night like this." Sophie immediately claimed her favorite spot on the couch, patting the cushion beside her for Victoria to sit. "This is the best spot," she explained. "You can see the fireplace and the TV, and if you scrunch down, you can see the stars through the window." Victoria settled beside Sophie with careful grace, accepting a mug of hot chocolate with trembling hands. Whether from cold or something else, Ethan couldn't tell. "This is wonderful," Victoria said after taking a sip. "It's been years since I've had real hot chocolate." "Years?" Sophie asked incredulously. "What do you drink when it's cold?" Victoria smiled ruefully. "Coffee mostly. Lots and lots of coffee." "That sounds terrible," Sophie declared with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Coffee is yucky. Daddy drinks it, but he makes faces when he thinks I'm not looking." This earned a laugh from everyone, including Ethan. "Hey, I heard that, kiddo." "It's true, though," Sophie insisted, grinning. "You scrunch up your nose like this." She demonstrated making such an exaggerated expression that even Victoria burst into genuine laughter. Watching Victoria with his daughter Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. There was a natural ease between them that surprised him, as if they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. Sophie, who was usually shy around strangers, was treating Victoria like a beloved aunt she hadn't seen in ages. "Victoria, Mrs. Henderson said, settling into her favorite armchair with her own mug of tea. "What line of work are you in, dear?" Victoria's smile faltered slightly, and she took another sip of hot chocolate before answering. "Business," she said vaguely. "Corporate consulting." It was clearly a deflection, but Mrs. Henderson was too polite to press. Ethan, however, found himself studying Victoria more intently. Her hands were soft manicured, not the hands of someone who did physical labor. Her posture spoke of boardrooms and conference calls, and despite being stranded in a rainstorm, there was an air of quiet authority about her that suggested she was used to being in charge. "What about you, Ethan?" Victoria asked, clearly wanting to shift the conversation away from herself. "What do you do was construction," Ethan replied simply. "I work for Morrison Building Company. We're putting up the new shopping center on the east side of town." "He builds houses too," Sophie added proudly. "Big ones and little ones. He built Mrs. Peterson's deck all by himself." "That's impressive," Victoria said, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely meant it. "You must be very skilled." Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks. Compliments about his work always made him uncomfortable, especially from someone who clearly moved in more elevated circles than he did. "It's honest work," he said with a shrug. "Keeps a roof over our heads and food on the table." "The most important things," Victoria agreed softly, her gaze drifting around the small living room again with that same wondering expression. As the evening wore on, Sophie regaled Victoria with stories about school, her friends, and her elaborate plans for her upcoming 8th birthday party. Victoria listened with rapt attention, asking questions and laughing at all the right moments. She seemed genuinely enchanted by Sophie's enthusiasm about everything, from her science project to her loose tooth. And then, Sophie continued gesticulating wildly with her half-eaten cookie. "Jimmy Patterson said girls couldn't build rockets, so I built one that went higher than his, and it had sparkles." "Good for you," Victoria said firmly. Never let anyone tell you what you can't do because you're a girl. There was an intensity in Victoria's voice that made both Ethan and Mrs. Henderson look at her more closely. It sounded like the voice of someone who had fought that particular battle more than once. "Did people tell you that you couldn't do things?" Sophie asked with the innocent perceptiveness that children sometimes possessed. Victoria's smile became sad. "Yes, sometimes they did, but I learned to prove them wrong." "Victoria," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "you mentioned you had an important meeting tomorrow. Won't people be worried when you don't show up?" For a moment, Victoria looked stricken, as if she'd forgotten about the outside world entirely. Then she shook her head. "It's complicated. But yes, there will be consequences." "Do you need to call someone?" Ethan offered. "You can use our phone." Victoria considered this for a long moment, then shook her head again. "No. Actually, I think a night away from all of that might be exactly what I need." There was something almost desperate in the way she said it, as if she were clinging to this temporary respite from whatever waited for her in the morning. As the clock on the mantel chimed 9 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson began gathering the empty mugs. "Well, I should be getting home," she announced. "Sophie, you need to get ready for bed soon. School tomorrow, storm or no storm." Sophie's face fell. "But Victoria just got here." "Victoria will still be here in the morning," Ethan assured her, though he caught Victoria's slight flinch at the words. "Go on, kiddo. Brush your teeth and get into your pajamas. I'll be up to tuck you in a few minutes." Sophie reluctantly headed upstairs, but not before extracting a promise from Victoria that she would still be there for breakfast. With Mrs. Henderson gone, and Sophie getting ready for bed, an awkward silence settled over the living room. Ethan found himself alone with this mysterious woman who seemed to carry shadows in her eyes and secrets in her careful words. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "For stopping, for bringing me here, for all of this." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Ethan replied, but Victoria shook her head. "No, they wouldn't have. You could have driven right past. Most people would have, especially with a child in the car." "Sophie wouldn't have let me," Ethan said with a small smile. "She's got a soft heart for anyone who needs help." "She's remarkable," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've raised an extraordinary little girl, Ethan." There was something in the way she said his name that made him look at her more closely. It was as if she were tasting it, testing how it felt on her tongue. "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly, the nagging sense of familiarity finally demanding acknowledgement. "There's something about you that seems—" Victoria's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked like a deer caught in headlights. No, I don't think so, I would remember." But even as she said it, Ethan could see the lie in her eyes. There was recognition there, buried beneath years and pain, but definitely there. "Daddy," Sophie's voice called from upstairs. "I'm ready." The moment broke and Victoria looked away quickly. "You should go to her," she said. "Don't keep her waiting on my account." Ethan hesitated, sensing that they were on the verge of something important, something that might explain the strange undercurrents he'd been feeling all evening. But Sophie called again, and his daughter would always come first. "We'll get your car fixed first thing in the morning," he promised, heading toward the stairs. "There's fresh towels in the guest bathroom, and I left some clothes on the bed. Make yourself at home." As Ethan climbed the stairs to tuck Sophie in, Victoria remained on the couch, staring into the fire with tears she didn't bother to hide. The house felt different with her in it, warmer, somehow more complete. It was a dangerous feeling, one that she couldn't afford to indulge. But as Sophie's laughter drifted down from upstairs, followed by Ethan's gentle voice reading a bedtime story, Victoria allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what it would be like to belong here. To be part of this small, perfect family that had welcomed her without question. The storm raged on outside, but inside the little house 3 hearts beat in a rhythm that felt almost like destiny. None of them knew that by morning everything would change. None of them suspected that Victoria's broken-down car was the least of the repairs that would need to be made. And none of them could have imagined that the biggest storm was yet to come. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the guest bedroom, casting soft golden rays across Victoria's face as she stirred from the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the empire she'd built, forgot the boardrooms and hostile takeovers that defined her daily existence. All she knew was the smell of coffee brewing downstairs and the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. Reality crashed back as she sat up her expensive clothes from yesterday, wrinkled and still slightly damp. The meeting. God, the meeting she was supposed to be leading in. She glanced at her watch. 2 hours. Her absence would send shockwaves through Hale Industries, would give her competitors the ammunition they'd been waiting for. But as she heard Sophie's voice calling for her daddy to hurry up with breakfast, Victoria found she couldn't bring herself to care. She made her way downstairs, following the sounds of domestic bliss that felt like something from a movie she'd watched but never experienced. In the kitchen, she found Ethan standing at the stove, his dark hair still mussed from sleep, flipping pancakes while Sophie sat at the small table coloring in a book with fierce concentration. "Morning," Ethan said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile that made Victoria's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Hope you slept okay. Coffee's fresh." "Like a baby," Victoria replied, accepting the mug he offered her. The warmth spread through her fingers, chasing away the last remnants of the cold that had settled in her bones during yesterday's storm. "Victoria," Sophie jumped up from her chair, practically bouncing with excitement. "I drew you a picture. Wanna see?" Before Victoria could respond, Sophie was pressing a piece of construction paper into her hands. The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a small house. A tall figure with dark hair labeled Daddy, a smaller figure with pigtails labeled Me, and a third figure with long hair and what appeared to be a crown labeled Princess Victoria. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the innocent artwork. In Sophie's 7-year-old mind, she belonged here, was part of this family portrait. The crown was a sweet touch, a reminder of their conversation about her name the night before. "It's beautiful, Sophie." Victoria managed her voice slightly hoarse. "I love it." "You can keep it," Sophie declared generously. "I'll make another one for Daddy to put on the fridge." Ethan set a plate of pancakes in front of Victoria, and she was surprised to realize how hungry she was. When was the last time she'd eaten a real breakfast, instead of grabbing a protein bar between meetings? "So," Ethan said, settling into his chair across from her, "I called Jim's auto shop first thing this morning. He can have that radiator hose replaced by noon, but he needs to order the part from the city. Might not be ready until late afternoon." Victoria felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Another day away from the corporate world that consumed her life. Another day in this warm bubble of normalcy. But also another day of lying to these good people about who she really was. "That's fine," she said, cutting into her pancakes. "I'm in no rush." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She'd mentioned the important meeting last night, but Ethan was too polite to call her out on the contradiction. "Can Victoria come to school with us?" Sophie asked suddenly, syrup decorating her chin. "Show and tell is today, and I could tell everyone about how we saved a princess from the storm." Victoria nearly choked on her coffee. "Oh, sweetie, I don't think—" "That's not how show and tell works, kiddo," Ethan interrupted gently. "Victoria's our guest, not a show and tell item." Sophie's face fell, but she brightened quickly with the resilience of childhood. "Okay, but can she help me with my art project after school? Miss Peterson wants us to draw our families, and I want to make it extra special." The casual way Sophie included Victoria in her definition of family sent another jolt through Victoria's chest. This child, this precious little girl, had accepted her completely within the span of a single evening. It was the kind of unconditional acceptance Victoria had forgotten existed. "We'll see," Ethan said, his eyes meeting Victoria's across the table. There was something searching in his gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't even know who he was working on. After breakfast, Ethan and Sophie got ready for their respective days, him for the construction site, her for second grade. Victoria found herself helping Sophie pack her backpack, checking that she had her homework and her lunch money, falling into the routine as if she'd been doing it for years. "Bye, Victoria," Sophie called as Ethan loaded her into the car. "Don't go anywhere, okay? Promise?" "I promise," Victoria called back, the words coming easier than they should have. She stood in the doorway watching them drive away, Ethan's hand raised in a wave, Sophie's face pressed against the window, blowing kisses. Alone in the house for the first time since the storm, Victoria felt the weight of silence settle around her. The corporate world she'd left behind seemed to exist in another universe entirely. Here, surrounded by Sophie's artwork and Ethan's simple furniture, she could almost pretend she was someone else, someone who belonged in a place like this. Her phone had died completely the night before, and she found herself reluctant to ask Ethan about a charger. Whatever fires were burning at Hale Industries would have to burn without her for now. Let Marcus handle the vultures circling their latest acquisition. Let the board members panic about her absence. For the first time in 20 years, Victoria Hale was choosing to be somewhere else. She spent the morning exploring the small house, not snooping exactly, but absorbing the details of lives lived with intention and love. Sophie's room was an explosion of color and creativity, every surface covered with drawings, craft projects, and treasured toys. Ethan's room was simpler, but no less revealing, books about child development stacked on his nightstand, a photo of him and infant Sophie on his dresser, work clothes neatly hung in a closet, clearly been organized with care. It was the photo that stopped her cold. Ethan looked so young, maybe 25 or 26, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. His face was radiant with love and wonder, the expression of a man who'd found his purpose. But there was something else in his eyes, a shadow of sadness, that suggested the joy had come at a cost. Victoria picked up the frame, studying the image more closely. Sophie had been such a beautiful baby, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed too old for her tiny face. There was something hauntingly familiar about those eyes, something that made Victoria's heart race with a recognition she couldn't quite place. She was 6 months old when I adopted her. Victoria spun around to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his work clothes traded for jeans and a flannel shirt. She'd been so absorbed in the photograph that she hadn't heard him come home. "I'm sorry," she stammered quickly, setting the frame back on the dresser. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's okay," Ethan said, moving into the room with easy familiarity. "I came back to grab some tools I forgot. Thought you might like some company." He picked up the photograph himself, his thumb tracing over the glass, with the gentle reverence of a man looking at his greatest treasure. Sophie was born to a teenage mother who couldn't keep her. He continued, his voice soft with memory. "The adoption agency called me when she was about 4 months old. Said they had a baby who needed a home and would I be interested. I took one look at her and knew she was meant to be mine. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed his words. The timeline. Sophie's age, the way the little girl had seemed so familiar from the moment they'd met. It was impossible, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a pattern that terrified her. The birth mother? Victoria managed her voice barely above a whisper. Did you ever meet her? Ethan shook his head, setting the photo back down. She wanted to remain anonymous. All I know is that she was young, unmarried, and felt she couldn't provide the life Sophie deserved. The agency said she agonized over the decision, but ultimately wanted what was best for her baby. Victoria felt the room spin around her as memories crashed over her like a tidal wave. 20 years old, pregnant and terrified. Her father's rage when he discovered her condition. The ultimatum: give up the baby for adoption and inherit the family business, or keep the child and be disowned completely. She'd been whisked away to a private facility hidden from the world. Until she gave birth to a daughter, she was allowed to hold for exactly 10 minutes before the baby was taken away forever. Are you okay? Ethan's voice seemed to come from very far away. Victoria, you look like you've seen a ghost. She had seen a ghost, the ghost of the daughter she'd been forced to give up, the child she'd never stopped thinking about, never stopped wondering about. Sophie. Her Sophie. The baby she'd named Sarah in her heart, but had never been allowed to name officially. I need some air, Victoria gasped, pushing past Ethan and stumbling toward the door. Her legs felt like rubber, her chest tight with the weight of a secret that threatened to destroy everything. Ethan followed her outside, his concern evident in every line of his body. Victoria, what's wrong? You look like you're about to pass out. She made it to the front porch before her knees gave out, sinking onto the wooden steps as years of carefully buried grief threatened to overwhelm her. Ethan sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Talk to me, he said gently. Whatever it is, maybe I can help. Victoria laughed, but it came out broken and harsh. You can't help with this, Ethan. No one can. Try me. She looked at him, then really looked at him, taking in the kind eyes and the genuine concern written across his features. This man had given Sophie everything Victoria couldn't: stability, love, a home filled with laughter and security. He'd been the father she'd dreamed of for her daughter during those long, lonely years of wondering. When I was 20, she began, her voice barely audible. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I fell in love with someone my family didn't approve of, and I got pregnant. Ethan's expression didn't change, didn't judge. He simply waited for her to continue. My father gave me a choice: give up the baby and take my place in the family business, or keep the child and lose everything. He said he wouldn't have a bastard grandchild, ruining the family name. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, poisonous with years of resentment and regret. So you chose the business, Ethan said quietly, and there was no condemnation in his voice, only understanding. I chose survival, Victoria corrected. I was 20 years old, unmarried, with no education and no way to support a child. My father controlled everything: my trust fund, my inheritance, even the roof over my head. Without his support, my baby and I would have had nothing. What happened to the father? Victoria's smile was bitter. He never knew. By the time I realized I was pregnant, he was gone. Vanished without a word, leaving me to face the consequences alone. It was partially true. Michael had disappeared, but not before she'd tried desperately to find him, to tell him about the baby they'd created together. But he'd left town the day after graduation, chasing dreams of artistic success in the big city, and all her letters had come back unopened. "I've spent 20 years building an empire," Victoria continued, staring out at the quiet street lined with modest homes. "I have more money than I could spend, in 10 lifetimes more power than most people could imagine. But I've never stopped wondering about her. Never stopped regretting that choice." Ethan's voice was carefully neutral, but Victoria could hear the tension underlying it. "My daughter. I had a daughter." The words hung in the air between them, like a confession heavy with implications neither of them was ready to face. They sat in silence for long minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Victoria was drowning in memories she'd spent years suppressing the weight of her newborn daughter in her arms. The perfect, tiny fingers that had gripped hers with surprising strength, the way the baby had looked at her, with dark, serious eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. "Victoria," Ethan said finally, his voice strange and strained. "When was your daughter born?" She knew what he was asking, knew why his hands were trembling as he waited for her answer. The same terrible possibility that had occurred to her was clearly taking root in his mind as well. "March 15th, she whispered. 7 years and 6 months ago." Ethan's sharp intake of breath was audible in the morning stillness. "That's Sophie's birthday. March 15th. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, years of suppressed grief and desperate hope breaking free all at once. "The adoption agency," she managed through her tears. "Do you remember which one?" "Riverside Family Services," Ethan replied mechanically, his face pale with shock. "Downtown office on 5th Street. Victoria's world tilted on its axis. Riverside Family Services. The same agency her father had used, the one that had promised complete anonymity and a good home for her baby. The same place where she'd signed papers that had felt like signing away her soul. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, running his hands through his hair. "Victoria, are you saying... Do you think Sophie might be..." "I don't know," Victoria said quickly, though every instinct screamed that she did know, had known from the moment she'd looked into Sophie's eyes the night before. It could be a coincidence. There are probably dozens of children born that day adopted through that agency. But even as she said it, she knew they were both thinking the same thing. The resemblance between Victoria and Sophie wasn't just superficial. It was in the shape of their eyes, the curve of their smiles, the way they both gestured with their hands when they talked. Details that might be overlooked by strangers, but were glaringly obvious once you knew to look for them. "We need to know for sure," Ethan said, his voice hoarse with emotion. We can't leave this hanging between us." Victoria nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks with shaking hands. "The adoption records would be sealed, but I might be able to. I have resources, connections." It was a polite way of saying she could buy the information they needed, could use her influence to access records that were supposed to remain confidential forever. The thought made her sick, but not as sick as the possibility of walking away without knowing the truth. "If she is..." Ethan began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "If she is my daughter," Victoria said, forcing herself to voice the words that terrified her, "then you're the one who saved her. You gave her everything I couldn't love, stability, a real family. I could never take that away from her." "But you'd want to be part of her life," Ethan said, and it wasn't a question. Victoria closed her eyes, imagining the impossible family dinners, bedtime stories, school plays where she could sit in the audience and cheer for her daughter. The dreams she'd buried so deep, She'd almost forgotten they existed. "I'd want whatever was best for Sophie," she said finally, "even if that means staying away." They were interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming, followed by rapid footsteps on the sidewalk. Victoria looked up to see a tall man in an expensive suit striding toward them, his face grim with purpose. Behind him, a black sedan idled at the curb, with two more men in suits visible through the tinted windows. "Ms. Hale," the man said, as he approached, his tone respectful but firm. "I'm Agent Marcus from your security detail. We've been looking for you." Victoria felt Ethan tense beside her as the reality of her true identity crashed into their small bubble of normalcy. She wasn't just Victoria, the stranded woman they'd helped in a storm. She was Victoria Hale, CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country, a woman whose disappearance had apparently triggered a manhunt. "How did you find me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. GPS tracking in her car credit card records the vast network of resources at her disposal that she'd forgotten were equally available to others. "Your car was spotted on highway surveillance," Marcus replied. "We've been searching all night. The board is in emergency session, and the media is starting to ask questions about your absence from this morning's merger announcement." Victoria felt the weight of her real life settling back onto her shoulders like a lead blanket. The merger. God, she'd completely forgotten about the deal that was supposed to close today, the acquisition that would expand Hale Industries into 3 new markets and add another $1 billion to their valuation. "I need a few more hours," she said, not looking at Ethan, though she could feel his shock radiating beside her. "Ms. Hale, with respect, the situation is critical. Every hour you're missing gives our competitors more ammunition. There are already rumors about your mental state suggestions that you're not fit to lead the company." Victoria stood slowly, feeling the familiar armor of corporate responsibility sliding back into place. This was who she really was, not the woman who'd laughed at Sophie's stories and helped pack school lunches, but the ice queen who crushed competitors and built empires. "Give me 15 minutes, she told Marcus. "I'll be right out." Marcus nodded and retreated to the sedan, though Victoria could feel his watchful gaze from across the yard. She turned back to Ethan, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Victoria Hale," he said slowly, testing the name. "As in Hale Industries, the woman on the cover of Forbes last month." "That's me," Victoria admitted, unable to meet his eyes. "The corporate shark, the ruthless CEO, the woman who built an empire on other people's failures." "The billionaire," Ethan added quietly. Victoria winced. "Yes, that too." They stared at each other across a gulf that suddenly seemed unbridgeable. She was Victoria Hale, whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries. He was Ethan Carter, a construction worker who drove a 10-year-old Honda and worried about making rent. Last night, when she'd just been Victoria, those differences hadn't mattered. Now they loomed between them like a canyon. "So what happens now?" Ethan asked. "Do you go back to your corporate world and pretend this never happened?" "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "I've never been in this situation before." "What situation? Meeting your daughter or slumming it with the working class?" The bitterness in his voice cut deep, but Victoria couldn't blame him for it. In his eyes, she'd been lying to him from the moment they'd met, pretending to be someone she wasn't. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "Everything I showed you last night, everything I felt that was real, more real than anything I've experienced in years. But it wasn't the whole truth." "No," Victoria admitted. "It wasn't." Ethan stood up, pacing to the edge of the porch, as if he needed distance to think clearly. "Sophie's going to be heartbroken when you disappear. She was so excited to show you her art project, to have you help with her homework." "I know." The words came out broken, weighted with all the guilt Victoria had been carrying for 7 years. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe it's better if she doesn't know. Doesn't know what? That her birth mother is alive and successful and could give her everything money can buy. Or doesn't know that her birth mother is someone who chooses corporate mergers over her own child. The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes again. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Ethan turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a protective fury she'd never seen before. You have a choice right now, Victoria. You can walk away and go back to your billion-dollar empire, or you can stay and figure out how to be part of Sophie's life. Which is it going to be? Victoria looked toward the sedan where Marcus waited, then back at the small house where Sophie would return from school in a few hours, excited to share her day with the woman she'd decided was a princess. The weight of 20 years of carefully constructed walls pressed down on her, warring with a desperate longing to belong somewhere to someone. I have responsibilities, she said weakly. People depend on me. The company will survive without you for a few more hours, Ethan finished. But Sophie might not survive losing another mother. The words hit home with devastating accuracy. Victoria had already abandoned Sophie, once choosing security over love, success over family. Was she really going to do it again? I need to make a call, she said, finally pulling out her phone and realizing it was still dead. Can I use your phone? Ethan nodded, leading her back into the house. Victoria dialed a number she knew by heart, her hands shaking as she waited for an answer. Marcus, it's Victoria, she said when her assistant picked up. Cancel the rest of today's meetings. Push the merger announcement to tomorrow morning. But Mrs. Hale, the board specifically requested. The board works for me, not the other way around, Victoria said, with more authority than she'd felt in hours. Tell them I'm conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition. They'll understand. She hung up before Marcus could protest further, then looked at Ethan with eyes that held a desperate hope. I can give you today, she said. One day to figure out what this means, to decide what's best for Sophie. And if the DNA test confirms what we both already know. Victoria thought about Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator, about the way the little girl had included her in the family portrait, without question about the dreams she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. Then we figure out how to make this work, she said, somehow. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a school bus rumbled down the street, and Victoria felt her heart begin to race. In a few minutes, Sophie would come bounding through that door, full of stories about her day, and eager to spend time with the woman she'd adopted as friend and family. The woman who might actually be both. Victoria Hale, who had faced down hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations without flinching, had never been more terrified in her life. The school bus wheezed to a stop at the corner, its familiar yellow bulk a stark contrast to the black sedan still idling in the driveway. Victoria felt her pulse quicken as she watched through the window Ethan standing rigid beside her, both of them suspended in a moment that would either shatter their worlds or rebuild them entirely. Sophie's voice reached them before they could see her, a bright chatter directed at her friend Emma as they walked down the sidewalk together. Victoria's breath caught as she got her first clear daylight look at the child who might be her daughter. The resemblance was even more striking now, the way Sophie held her head when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands as she gestured, the determined set of her small shoulders that Victoria recognized from her own reflection. She's early today, Ethan murmured, his voice tight with tension. Sometimes the bus runs ahead of schedule. Victoria nodded, unable to speak. Through the window, she watched Sophie skip up the front walk, her backpack bouncing with each step, her face radiant with the uncomplicated joy of a child coming home. In just moments, that joy might be shattered by truths too complex for a 7-year-old to understand. The front door burst open with the characteristic enthusiasm of childhood. "Daddy Victoria, I'm home." Sophie's voice rang through the house like a bell, pure and sweet, and completely trusting. "In here, sweetheart." Ethan called, his voice carefully controlled. Victoria could see the effort it took for him to sound normal, to push down the earthquake of emotions that had been building since her revelation on the porch. Sophie appeared in the living room doorway like a small tornado, her school clothes already rumpled from the day's adventures. Her eyes went immediately to Victoria, and her face lit up with the kind of pure happiness that Victoria had forgotten existed. "You stayed!" Sophie exclaimed, dropping her backpack and rushing toward Victoria with arms outstretched. "I was worried you might leave while I was at school." Victoria caught Sophie in a hug that felt like coming home and losing everything all at once. The child's small body fit perfectly against hers, warm and solid, and heartbreakingly real. For a moment, Victoria allowed herself to imagine this was normal, that she had the right to hold this little girl, to be the recipient of such uncomplicated love. "I promised I'd be here." Victoria managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I always keep my promises." It was a dangerous thing to say, loaded with implications she wasn't sure she could fulfill. But looking down into Sophie's trusting eyes, Victoria found she meant every word. "Guess what happened at school today?" Sophie said, pulling back with excitement. "Mrs. Peterson loved my drawing of our family, and she wants to put it up on the wall for everyone to see. And Tommy Martinez said his dad might know about fixing cars, so I told him about your car being broken, and he said his dad could probably help too." The casual way Sophie continued to include Victoria in their family narrative was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. This child had no idea that the woman she'd so easily adopted as family might actually be family in the most literal sense. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Ethan said, his eyes meeting Victoria's over Sophie's head. The look they shared was weighted with unspoken questions and fears. "Can we work on my art project now?" Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes with anticipation. "I want to make it really special since Victoria's here to help." Victoria felt her chest tighten. "What kind of art project?" "We have to draw our families and write about what makes them special," Sophie explained, already pulling art supplies from her backpack. "I was going to draw just me and Daddy, but now I can include you too." The innocent statement hit both adults like a physical blow. Ethan's face went pale, and Victoria felt tears threatening again. How could they explain to this trusting child that the woman she wanted to include in her family portrait might actually be the mother who'd given her away? "Sophie," Ethan began carefully, "maybe we should talk about—" "Oh, I almost forgot," Sophie interrupted, digging deeper into her backpack. "Mrs. Peterson gave us these permission slips for the DNA science unit we're starting next week. She said we can learn about how traits get passed down from parents to children. It's going to be so cool." Victoria's blood turned to ice as Sophie pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. DNA. The very thing they'd been discussing just minutes before now being thrust at them by the universe with what felt like cosmic irony. "DNA," Victoria repeated weakly. "Yeah, Mrs. Peterson says we can see how we get our eye color and hair color from our parents. She said some kids might even be able to trace their family trees." Sophie's enthusiasm was infectious, completely oblivious to the bombshell she'd just dropped into their midst. Ethan took the permission slip with hands that trembled slightly. "That sounds very educational. Will you sign it?" "Daddy, please, I really want to learn about where I came from." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. where she came from. Victoria felt the room spin around her as she looked at Sophie's eager face so full of innocent curiosity about the very secrets that were threatening to tear their small world apart. "Of course, sweetheart," Ethan said softly. "We'll definitely sign it." Victoria caught his eye and saw her own thoughts reflected there. The DNA testing that Sophie would be participating in at school could provide the answers they desperately needed, but it could also open doors that might be impossible to close again. "Now," Sophie said, spreading her art supplies across the coffee table with businesslike efficiency. "Let's work on my family picture. Victoria, you sit right here next to me so I can make sure I get your hair right." Victoria found herself being positioned on the couch with the gentle but firm authority that only children possessed. Sophie settled beside her with paper and crayons, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she began to sketch. "Tell me about your family." "Victoria," Sophie said as she worked. "Do you have brothers and sisters? What about your mommy and daddy?" The questions were innocent, the natural curiosity of a child getting to know someone new. But each one felt like a dagger to Victoria's heart. How could she explain that her family was a cold, corporate empire built on duty and expectation rather than love? How could she tell this warm, loving child about a father who'd forced her to choose between her baby and her future? "My family is complicated," Victoria said carefully. "My father was a businessman, very focused on work. He passed away a few years ago." "That's sad," Sophie said, with the matter-of-fact sympathy of childhood. "What about your mommy?" "She died when I was young, younger than you are now." Sophie's small hand found Victoria's and squeezed with surprising strength. "That's really sad. But you know what? When mommies go to heaven, they still love their babies forever and ever. My mommy in heaven loves me, and I bet yours loves you too." Victoria's throat closed up completely. If only it were that simple. If only love were enough to bridge the gaps that money and power and impossible choices had created. "You're very wise, Sophie," Victoria managed. "That's what Daddy says too. He says I get it from my birth mommy. He says she must have been really smart and really brave." Ethan's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Victoria felt the walls closing in around her as Sophie unknowingly walked closer and closer to the truth. "Your daddy says that—" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie nodded, still focused on her drawing. "He says my birth mommy loved me so much that she wanted to make sure I had the best life possible, even if it meant she couldn't be with me. He says that's the bravest thing anyone can do." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she stared at this incredible man who had somehow found a way to honor the woman who'd given up his daughter even without knowing who she was. Ethan had turned Victoria's greatest shame into Sophie's greatest strength, had taught their daughter to see love in abandonment rather than rejection in absence. "Your daddy sounds like a very special man," Victoria said, her eyes finding Ethan's across the room. "He's the best daddy in the whole world," Sophie agreed. "But sometimes I think he gets lonely. That's why I'm so happy you're here. He smiles different when you're around." The observation was delivered with the casual honesty that only children possessed, but it hit both adults with stunning force. Victoria saw Ethan's face flush slightly, saw something vulnerable and hopeful flicker in his eyes before he looked away. "There," Sophie announced, holding up her paper with pride. "What do you think?" Victoria looked down at the drawing and felt her world tilt on its axis. Sophie had drawn the three of them standing in front of the little house, but this wasn't the simple stick figure art of the morning. This drawing showed remarkable detail and skill for a 7-year-old Victoria. And Sophie had the same long dark hair, the same smile, even the same way of standing with one hip slightly cocked. Ethan stood beside them with his arm protectively around both of them, and above their heads, Sophie had drawn a heart with the words, "My family," written in careful letters. "It's perfect," Victoria whispered, and she meant it. Despite everything, despite the lies and secrets and impossible complications, there was something right about the picture Sophie had drawn. Something that felt like destiny. "Can I ask you something, Victoria?" Sophie said, setting down her crayons and turning to face her with serious eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. Do you think families are just people who live together? Or can they be people who love each other even if they're not the same?" The question was so mature, so thoughtful, that Victoria wondered if Sophie somehow sensed the undercurrents swirling around her. Children were often more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. "I think families are about love," Victoria said carefully. "About people who care for each other and want what's best for each other, even when it's hard." Sophie nodded solemnly. "That's what I think too. So even if someone isn't your mommy or daddy by born, they can still be family if they love you enough." "Yes," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "I think that's exactly right." "Good," Sophie said with satisfaction. "Because I decided you're family now. You can't take it back once I decide." The declaration was made with such finality, such absolute certainty, that Victoria felt her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. This child, this beautiful, incredible child, who might be her daughter, had claimed her as family, without knowing their potential connection. It was the kind of unconditional acceptance Victoria had never experienced, not even from her own father. "Sophie," Ethan said gently, "there's something Victoria and I need to talk to you about." Victoria's heart stopped. They hadn't discussed how to approach this conversation, hadn't prepared Sophie for the possibility that her life might be about to change dramatically. But looking at the trust in Sophie's eyes, Victoria realized they couldn't keep lying to her, couldn't let her get more attached without knowing the truth. "Am I in trouble?" Sophie asked, her voice suddenly small. "No, sweetheart, not at all," Victoria said, quickly reaching for Sophie's hand. "You could never be in trouble. You're perfect exactly as you are." "Then what is it?" Ethan moved closer, settling on Sophie's other side so they formed a protective circle around her. "Remember how we've talked about how you're adopted, how your birth mommy loved you but couldn't take care of you?" Sophie nodded. "And then you adopted me and became my real daddy." "That's right. Well, Victoria and I have been talking, and we think there's a chance that Victoria might be your birth mommy." The words hung in the air like a bombshell waiting to explode. Sophie looked back and forth between them, her 7-year-old mind working to process information that would be overwhelming for an adult. "You mean, Victoria is my mommy, my real mommy?" "We don't know for sure yet," Ethan said quickly. "We would need to do some tests to find out, but there are some things that make us think it might be possible." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her drawing, with an expression too serious for her young face. Victoria held her breath, terrified of what the child's reaction might be: anger, confusion, rejection. "Is that why you seemed sad yesterday?" Sophie asked suddenly, looking up at Victoria with those dark, perceptive eyes. "Because you missed me." Victoria's composure shattered completely. "Oh, sweetheart," she sobbed, pulling Sophie into her arms. "I've missed you every single day for 7 years. Every single day." Sophie hugged her back with fierce strength, her small arms wrapping around Victoria's neck like she never wanted to let go. "It's okay," she whispered. You found me now. That's what matters. The simple forgiveness, the immediate acceptance was more than Victoria had ever dared to hope for. She'd spent 7 years torturing herself with guilt and regret, and this incredible child was offering absolution with the ease of someone who'd never learned to hold grudges. But I don't understand something, Sophie said, pulling back to look at Victoria with a puzzled frown. If you're my birth mommy, why didn't you keep me? Daddy says birth mommies only give up their babies if they can't take care of them, but you have lots of money. I can tell because your clothes are fancy and your car is really nice. The question was innocent, but devastating. How could Victoria explain to a 7-year-old the complex web of family pressure, social expectations, and impossible choices that had led to her decision? How could she make Sophie understand without poisoning her against the grandfather she'd never known? Sometimes, Victoria said carefully, adults make decisions based on fear instead of love. When I was having you, I was very young and very scared. My father told me that I couldn't give you the life you deserved, that it would be better for both of us if someone else raised you. But that was silly, Sophie said with the brutal honesty of childhood. You could have learned how to be a good mommy. Daddy didn't know how to be a daddy when he got me, but he learned. Victoria felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. You're absolutely right, sweetheart. It was silly. It was the worst mistake I ever made. But if you hadn't made that mistake, I wouldn't have Daddy, Sophie pointed out with the kind of logical thinking that amazed Victoria. And Daddy wouldn't have me. So maybe it wasn't really a mistake. Maybe it was just part of the plan. Ethan's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. You are the wisest little girl in the whole world, Sophie Carter. I know, Sophie said matter-of-factly, making both adults laugh despite the tears. So what happens now? Are you going to take me away, Victoria? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. She looked at Ethan, seeing her own panic reflected in his eyes. The thought of taking Sophie away from the only father she'd ever known was unthinkable. But the idea of walking away again was equally devastating. No, Victoria said firmly. No, sweetheart, I would never take you away from Daddy. You belong here with him. This is your home, your family. But you could stay too, Sophie said hopefully. You could be part of our family. I drew the picture and everything. Victoria's heart broke and soared simultaneously. This child was offering her everything she'd ever wanted, wrapped up in crayon drawings and innocent hope. But the reality was so much more complicated than Sophie could understand. It's not that simple, baby girl, Ethan said gently. Victoria has a very important job, a big company to run. She can't just stay here with us. Why not? Sophie asked with the directness that only children possessed. If she's my mommy and you're my daddy, then you should both stay with me. That's how families work. Victoria looked around the small living room with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in Sophie's artwork. Everything about this place was the opposite of her sterile penthouse apartment, her corner office with its panoramic city views. This was warmth and love and belonging, everything her money had never been able to buy. Maybe we could figure something out, Victoria said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Maybe there's a way to make this work. Ethan stared at her. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe Sophie's right. Maybe families are about love, not logistics. Maybe I've been running from the wrong things all these years. Before either of them could respond, the front door opened, and Mrs. Henderson's voice called out cheerfully, "Hello, dear ones. I brought some fresh bread from the bakery." The elderly woman appeared in the living room doorway, took one look at the tear-stained faces and emotional intensity, and stopped short. Oh my, Is everything all right? Sophie jumped up from the couch with renewed energy. Mrs. Henderson, guess what? Victoria might be my birth mommy. Isn't that amazing? Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up to her hairline as she looked between Victoria and Ethan with sharp, assessing eyes. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Well, I'll be. That would explain a few things. What do you mean? Ethan asked. The resemblance, for one thing. I noticed it last night but didn't want to say anything. And the way you look at her, Victoria, like you're memorizing every detail. That's not how strangers look at children. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. Apparently, she'd been more transparent than she'd realized. We're going to do a DNA test, Sophie announced importantly. At school for science class, Mrs. Peterson is going to teach us all about family traits and genetics. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. That's quite a coincidence. Or fate, Victoria murmured, thinking about the permission slip that had appeared just when they needed answers most. What happens if the test confirms it? Mrs. Henderson asked quietly, her tone gentle but probing. What then? It was the question they'd all been dancing around the elephant in the room that grew larger with each passing moment. Victoria looked at Sophie, still bright-eyed with excitement, about the possibility of having found her birth mother, then at Ethan, whose expression showed a mixture of hope and terror. I don't know, Victoria admitted. I've never been in this situation before. None of us have, Ethan added. We're all just trying to figure it out as we go. Sophie climbed back onto the couch between them, taking both their hands in her small ones. I know what should happen, she announced with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem she couldn't solve. What's that, sweetheart? Victoria asked. We should be a family, all of us together. Victoria can work on her computer here, and Daddy can build things, and I can go to school and draw pictures of our family that actually is our family. The solution was so simple, so pure in its logic that Victoria felt her breath catch. Out of the mouths of babes. Sophie had cut through all the complex adult reasoning and social expectations to arrive at the heart of the matter. They belonged together. It's not that simple, baby girl, Ethan said gently. Victoria lives in the city, has responsibilities. So I have responsibilities too. I have to feed my goldfish and do my homework and help Mrs. Peterson with the class pet. But I still have time for family. Victoria found herself laughing through her tears. She has a point. You're seriously considering this? Ethan asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Victoria looked around the room again, taking in every detail. The family photos on the mantel. The bookshelves filled with children's stories and parenting guides. The sense of home that permeated every corner. For 20 years, she'd built an empire that could buy anything money could purchase. But she'd never bought belonging. She'd never bought love. She'd never bought the simple joy of coming home to people who were genuinely happy to see her. I have enough money to last several lifetimes, Victoria said slowly. I could step back from the day-to-day operations work remotely for the important decisions. The company would survive without me micromanaging every detail. But would you survive without the company? Ethan asked. It's been your whole life for 20 years. Victoria thought about the cold efficiency of her penthouse, the loneliness of success without anyone to share it with, the hollow feeling that had been growing in her chest for years as she climbed higher and higher up the corporate ladder, only to realize she was climbing alone. Maybe it's time to find out what else life has to offer, she said. Mrs. Henderson had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize a turning point when she saw one. If I may, she said gently, perhaps you're all getting ahead of yourselves. Why don't you start with the DNA test? Confirm what your hearts already seem to know. Then you can make decisions about the future with all the facts. It was sensible advice, but Victoria found herself impatient with sensibility. For the first time in 20 years, she was making decisions with her heart instead of her head, and it felt terrifyingly liberating. Mrs. Henderson's right, Ethan said. We should take this one step at a time. Okay, Sophie said agreeably. But while we're waiting for the test results, Victoria should stay here with us. You know, just to make sure she's really my mommy, by testing if she fits in with our family. Victoria couldn't help but smile at Sophie's reasoning. That sounds like a very scientific approach. I learned it from Daddy. He always says you should test things before you decide if they work. The afternoon dissolved into something that felt remarkably normal despite the extraordinary circumstances. Sophie insisted on showing Victoria her room, her treasures, her carefully organized collection of rocks and shells and other 7-year-old treasures. Each item came with a detailed story that Victoria absorbed with the hunger of someone who'd missed 7 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and first days of school. When Ethan started preparing dinner, Victoria found herself automatically falling into the rhythm of domestic life with surprising ease. She chopped vegetables while Sophie set the table, and Ethan managed 3 different pots on the stove. And for a moment, Victoria could almost pretend this was her life, that she belonged in this warm kitchen with its cheerful chaos and casual intimacy. Victoria, Sophie said, as they sat down to eat. When the DNA test proves you're my mommy, can I call you Mom? The question stopped all conversation cold. Victoria felt her throat close up as she looked at this beautiful child who was offering her the title she'd dreamed of claiming for 7 years. Would you want to? Victoria managed. Sophie nodded solemnly. I think about my birth mommy sometimes, you know. I wonder if she thinks about me too, if she misses me, if she wishes she could tuck me in at night. Now I know she does. Victoria was crying openly now, all pretense of composure abandoned. Every night, sweetheart. Every single night. Then yes, Sophie said firmly. When we know for sure, I want to call you Mom. But Daddy will still be Daddy because he's the one who raised me and taught me how to ride my bike and makes the best pancakes in the world. Ethan's voice was rough when he spoke. That sounds perfect, kiddo. As they ate dinner, Victoria found herself marveling at the easy conversation, the way Sophie chattered about her day, while Ethan listened with the patient attention of someone who genuinely cared about 7-year-old concerns. This was family in its purest form, not the cold corporate dynasty she'd grown up in, but the warm, messy, beautiful reality of people who loved each other unconditionally. After dinner, as they settled in the living room for what had apparently become Sophie's designated homework time, Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed her assistant's number, and Victoria felt the familiar weight of corporate responsibility settling back onto her shoulders. I should take this, she said apologetically, stepping onto the front porch for privacy. Ms. Hale, her assistant's voice was tight with stress. The board is in emergency session. There are rumors about your mental health suggestions that you're having some kind of breakdown. The stock price has dropped 12% since news of your absence broke. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the pull of her corporate life trying to drag her back into its relentless gravity. Handle it, Marcus. Release a statement saying I'm conducting confidential due diligence on a potential acquisition. That should buy us some time. How much time, Ms. Hale? The shareholders are getting nervous, and our competitors are starting to circle. Victoria looked through the window at Sophie and Ethan, their heads bent together over homework, looking like the family portrait that had existed only in her dreams for 7 years. As much time as I need, she said firmly. And Marcus, clear my calendar for the next week. Everything. I don't care how important it seems. Ma'am, with all due respect, the Yamamoto deal closes Friday, and the Singapore expansion. We'll have to wait. Some things are more important than business, Marcus. She hung up before he could protest further, then turned off her phone entirely. For the first time in 20 years, Victoria Hale was choosing family over profit, love over power. The corporate world would have to survive without her for a while. When she returned to the living room, she found Sophie struggling with a math problem, while Ethan provided patient encouragement. The domestic scene was so perfectly normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Victoria felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't name. Need some help? She offered, settling beside Sophie on the couch. It's multiplication, Sophie said with a frustrated sigh. I just don't get why you need to know how many groups of things there are. Victoria smiled, remembering her own struggles with math at that age. Well, let's say you have 3 groups of friends and each group has 4 people. How would you figure out how many friends you have altogether? As they worked through the problem together, Victoria felt a sense of completeness she'd never experienced. This was what she'd given up 7 years ago, not just a child, but the chance to be part of something bigger than herself, something that mattered more than stock prices and market share. By the time Sophie was ready for bed, Victoria felt as if she'd lived an entire lifetime in the span of a single day. The revelation about Sophie's possible parentage, the decision to stay and find out the truth, the glimpse of what family could actually be, it was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Will you help Daddy tuck me in? Sophie asked as they headed upstairs. I want both my parents to say goodnight. The casual use of parents sent another jolt through Victoria's system. Sophie had already integrated her into the family structure, with the easy acceptance of childhood, treating the possibility of their connection as fact rather than hypothesis. In Sophie's bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of childhood stuffed animals and art supplies and books scattered everywhere, Victoria felt the last of her corporate armor falling away. This was real life, messy and complicated, and absolutely perfect. Sweet dreams, baby girl, Ethan said, kissing Sophie's forehead. Sweet dreams, sweetheart. Victoria added, her voice catching on the endearment. I love you both, Sophie declared sleepily. My whole family. As they turned off the lights and headed back downstairs, Victoria felt the weight of the day settling around her like a blanket. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of confirming what they all already knew in their hearts. Tomorrow, the DNA test would provide scientific proof of what Sophie's existence had already proven, that love was stronger than fear, that family was about more than blood, and that sometimes the most important journeys brought you home to people you'd never stopped missing. So, Ethan said, as they settled back in the living room. What happens now? Victoria looked around the small room that had become the center of her universe in the span of 24 hours. Through the window, she could see the black sedan still waiting, a reminder of the corporate world that expected her return. But here, in this warm space filled with love and laughter and belonging, that world seemed very far away. Now, Victoria said, we find out if DNA can prove what my heart already knows. And then we figure out how to build the family we should have had all along. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a prayer all at once. Outside, the storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind the kind of crystal-clear evening that made everything seem possible. And inside the small house where a single father and his daughter had welcomed a stranger, 3 hearts beat in rhythm with the hope that broken things could be mended, that lost things could be found, and that love really could conquer all. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Victoria found herself standing at the stove making pancakes with the same careful attention she'd once reserved for billion-dollar mergers. 3 days had passed since her world had been turned upside down, and she was still marveling at how naturally she'd slipped into the rhythm of domestic life. The DNA test results were due any moment, but Victoria had already made her peace with what they would reveal. Some truths didn't need scientific confirmation. "Perfect circles, just like Daddy makes them," Sophie observed from her perch at the kitchen table, watching Victoria flip pancakes with growing confidence. "You're getting really good at this, Victoria." "I had an excellent teacher," Victoria replied, glancing at Ethan as he packed Sophie's lunch for school. The past few days had been a revelation in more ways than one. Watching Ethan navigate the complex choreography of single parenthood had filled Victoria with both admiration and guilt. How different might their lives have been if she'd found the courage to choose love over security 7 years ago. The phone rang just as Victoria was plating the last pancake, and all three of them froze. They'd been expecting the call from Dr. Morrison at the genetics lab, but now that the moment had arrived, no one seemed eager to answer. "I'll get it," Ethan said finally, his voice carefully controlled. He picked up the phone on the third ring. "Hello?" Victoria watched his face as he listened, searching for any clue about what the doctor was telling him. Sophie had abandoned her breakfast entirely, her dark eyes wide with anticipation. "I see," Ethan said finally. "Yes, we'll be there this afternoon to discuss the results. Thank you, Dr. Morrison." He hung up and turned to face them, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Well," Victoria whispered, "he wants to see us in person to discuss the results. Said it's lab policy for paternity, for family confirmation tests." Sophie bounced in her chair. "That means it's true, right? Otherwise he would just say no on the phone." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. After 7 years of wondering, 7 years of guilt and regret and carefully buried hope, she was about to have scientific confirmation of what her soul had known from the moment she'd looked into Sophie's eyes. "We'll know for sure this afternoon," Ethan said gently. "But sweetheart, whatever the results say, nothing changes how much we all love each other, okay?" Sophie nodded solemnly, but Victoria could see the excitement bubbling beneath her composed exterior. This child who had accepted the possibility of having found her birth mother with such grace and maturity was still at heart a 7-year-old who wanted her family to be complete. The school day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Victoria found herself cleaning the already spotless house, organizing Sophie's art supplies, doing anything to keep her hands busy, while her mind raced with possibilities. What would she say to Sophie when they had confirmation? How would she explain 7 years of absence? How would she fit into a life that had functioned perfectly well without her? Ethan had taken the afternoon off work, claiming a family emergency that was more truthful than his supervisor could have imagined. When they picked Sophie up from school, she chattered nervously about her day, clearly as anxious as the adults to learn what Dr. Morrison would tell them. The genetics lab was housed in a modern medical building on the outskirts of town, all glass and steel efficiency, that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of her corporate world. Dr. Morrison was a kind-faced man in his 50s, who greeted them with the gentle professionalism of someone who delivered life-changing news on a regular basis. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around his desk. "I'm sure you're all anxious to hear the results." Sophie sat between Victoria and Ethan, her small hands gripping theirs with surprising strength. Victoria found herself holding her breath as Dr. Morrison opened the file on his desk. "Well," he said, with a smile that immediately told Victoria everything she needed to know. "The DNA analysis confirms with 99.7% certainty that Victoria Hale is Sophie's biological mother. The words hit Victoria like a physical force, even though she'd been expecting them. 7 years of wondering, of imagining, of dreaming had suddenly become scientific fact. Sophie was her daughter, her baby. The child she'd given up was sitting right beside her, very much alive and perfect and real. "I knew it," Sophie exclaimed, throwing her arms around Victoria with such enthusiasm that they nearly toppled out of their chairs. "I knew you were my mommy. I could feel it in my heart." Victoria held Sophie close, tears streaming down her face as 7 years of suppressed grief and joy finally found their release. This was her daughter, her child, the baby she'd held for 10 precious minutes before being forced to let go. "There's more," Dr. Morrison continued gently. "The genetic profile also shows some interesting family medical history that might be relevant for Sophie's future health care. Nothing concerning, but information that could be useful." As Dr. Morrison explained the technical details, Victoria found herself studying Sophie's face with new eyes. Her daughter. The resemblance that had seemed so striking before, but now made perfect sense, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, even the way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. "So what happens now?" Sophie asked when Dr. Morrison had finished his explanation. "Now that we know for sure, I mean." Victoria looked at Ethan, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They'd been so focused on confirming their suspicions that they hadn't fully considered the implications of being proven right. "That's something we'll need to figure out together," Ethan said carefully. "The important thing is that nothing changes how much we love you or how much we want what's best for you. But I can call Victoria Mom now, right? Since she really is my mom." The question hung in the air like a prayer. Victoria felt her throat close up as she looked at this incredible child who was offering her everything she'd ever wanted. "If that's what you want," Victoria managed, "I would be honored." "Good," Sophie said with satisfaction, "because I've been practicing. Mom, see, it sounds perfect." The simple word hit Victoria with more force than any corporate victory she'd ever achieved. Mom. She was somebody's mom. This beautiful, brilliant, perfect child was calling her mom. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts, as they processed the magnitude of what they'd just learned. Victoria stared out the window at the familiar streets of the small town that had somehow become home in just a few days, marveling at how completely her life had changed. When they arrived at the house, Victoria's corporate security detail was waiting in the driveway, their black sedan looking increasingly out of place in the neighborhood of modest homes and carefully tended gardens. "Ms. Hale," Agent Marcus approached as they got out of the car, his expression grim. "I need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." Victoria felt the familiar weight of corporate responsibility settling back onto her shoulders, but she was surprised to find it felt heavier than before, more burdensome. "What kind of development?" "The board has called an emergency shareholders meeting. There are rumors about your mental state, suggestions that you're unfit to lead the company. Some of the major investors are getting nervous." Sophie tugged on Victoria's sleeve. "Mom, who are these men? Why do they look so serious?" The word mom in Sophie's innocent voice made Victoria's decision crystal clear. She knelt down to Sophie's level, her hands gentle on her daughter's shoulders. "These are people from my work, sweetheart. They're here because my job is very demanding, and they're not used to me taking time away." "Are you in trouble?" Sophie asked, her dark eyes wide with concern. "No, baby girl. I'm not in trouble. But I do need to make some important decisions about what's most important to me." Victoria stood and faced Agent Marcus with the commanding presence that had built an empire. Tell the board that I'll address their concerns in due time. But I'm not leaving. Not today. Ms. Hale, with all due respect, your absence is creating a crisis of confidence. The stock price has dropped 18%, and there are hostile takeover rumors. Then let them try, Victoria said coldly. I didn't build Hale Industries to be vulnerable to corporate vultures. If the company can't survive a few days without my micromanagement, then maybe I haven't done my job as well as I thought. Agent Marcus looked stunned. In all his years of working for Victoria, he'd never heard her dismiss corporate concerns so casually. Ma'am, perhaps if you could just make a brief appearance, reassure the investors. No. Victoria's voice brooked no argument. I have more important things to do right now, like figuring out how to be the mother my daughter deserves. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Victoria had just publicly declared that her family was more important than her empire, that love trumped profit in her personal hierarchy of values. Sophie beamed up at her with pure adoration. You chose us, she said simply. You chose your family. Always, Victoria said firmly. I chose wrong once, sweetheart. I won't make that mistake again. Agent Marcus retreated to his sedan to make what were undoubtedly frantic phone calls to the corporate headquarters, while Victoria, Ethan, and Sophie headed inside to figure out what their new reality would look like. Are you sure about this? Ethan asked once they were alone in the living room. You're talking about walking away from everything you've built. I'm talking about building something better, Victoria corrected. I've spent 20 years accumulating money and power, and what did it get me? A corner office and a penthouse apartment where I ate dinner alone every night. I don't want that life anymore. But the company, your employees, all those people who depend on you, will be fine. I have excellent managers, brilliant vice presidents, a board of directors who are more than capable of running day-to-day operations. Maybe it's time I trusted them to do their jobs. Sophie had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus of a child trying to understand adult complexities. Does this mean you're going to stay with us forever? Victoria felt her heart swell with an emotion so pure it was almost painful. If you'll have me, if your daddy thinks it's a good idea. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Victoria held her breath, realizing that her entire future hung on his answer. He could say no. He could reasonably argue that Sophie's life had been stable and happy without her, that introducing a biological mother into the equation would only create confusion and complications. Sophie, Ethan said finally, what do you think? Would you like Victoria, your mom, to stay and be part of our family? Yes, Sophie exclaimed without hesitation. I want us all to be together, like a real family. We already are a real family, sweetheart, Victoria said gently. We always have been. I just wasn't here to see it. Then it's settled, Ethan said, and Victoria heard something like relief in his voice. We'll figure out the details as we go. The evening passed in a blur of phone calls and difficult conversations. Victoria spent over an hour on the phone with her board of directors, explaining her decision to step back from day-to-day operations without giving them the full details of why. She could hear the panic in their voices, the corporate fear of uncertainty and change. Marcus will handle the immediate concerns, she told them finally. I'm appointing Sarah Chen as interim CEO while I pursue other interests. She's more than qualified, and the company will be in excellent hands. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. For 20 years, Victoria had defined herself by her corporate success, had measured her worth in stock prices and profit margins. Now she was choosing to define herself by love, by family, by the simple joy of being wanted and needed by people who cared about her as a person rather than as a business leader. After Sophie went to bed, Victoria and Ethan found themselves alone in the living room, the weight of the day's revelations settling around them like a blanket. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all a dream," Victoria said softly. "That Sophie isn't really my daughter, that you haven't really welcomed me into your lives, that I'm still alone in my penthouse wondering what happened to the baby I gave away." "It's not a dream," Ethan assured her. "Although I have to admit, it feels surreal to me too. 3 days ago, I was a single father with a quiet life. Now I'm part of something I never could have imagined." "Are you having second thoughts?" Victoria asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the family photos that covered the mantel. 7 years of birthdays and holidays and everyday moments that Victoria had missed. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared," he admitted finally. "Sophie's been my whole world for 7 years. I've made every decision based on what's best for her, filled our entire life around keeping her safe and happy. The thought of sharing that responsibility with someone else, it's terrifying." Victoria felt her heart sink. "I understand. If you think it would be better for Sophie—" "I'm not finished," Ethan interrupted gently. "Yes, I'm scared, but I'm also hopeful. Sophie's been asking questions about her birth mother for years. Where she came from, whether she was loved, if she ever thinks about her. Now she has answers. Now she knows she comes from love, that her mother thinks about her every day, that she's wanted by both her parents." "Both her parents," Victoria repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Ethan admitted. "More than I expected to." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, about how dramatically their lives had changed in such a short time. Outside, the small town was settling into its nighttime rhythm, porch lights flickering all on and families gathering around dinner tables. "Ethan," Victoria said finally, "I need you to know that I'm not trying to replace you or take over. You're Sophie's father in every way that matters. You're the one who raised her, who taught her right from wrong, who held her when she was sick and celebrated her achievements. I could never take that away from you, and I wouldn't want to." "Then what do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but probing. Victoria thought about the question, really considered what she hoped for in this new life she was building. "I want to be part of her life," she said slowly. "I want to know her favorite color and her biggest fears and what makes her laugh. I want to help with homework and attend school plays and be there for all the moments I've already missed. I want to learn how to be a mother." "And what about us?" Ethan asked quietly. "You and me." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had fully acknowledged. Over the past few days, Victoria had become aware of something growing between them, something that went beyond their shared love for Sophie. The way Ethan looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the easy intimacy that had developed as they navigated the domestic routines of family life, the way her heart skipped when he smiled at her. It was all pointing toward feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "I know there's something here, something between us, but everything's happened so fast, and we're both trying to figure out what's best for Sophie." "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now," Ethan suggested. "Maybe we can just take it one day at a time and see what develops naturally." Victoria nodded, grateful for his patience and understanding. "I'd like that." They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. "I can't sleep," she announced. "I keep thinking about how everything's different now." "Different how, sweetheart?" Victoria asked, making room for Sophie on the couch between them. "Good, different," Sophie clarified, snuggling against Victoria's side. Like how our family is bigger now, and how I have a mom and a dad who both live here with me, but also scary different because what if it changes again? What if you decide you don't want to stay? Victoria's heart broke at the vulnerability in Sophie's voice. This child had already experienced one abandonment by her birth mother, and now she was terrified of experiencing another. "Oh, baby girl," Victoria said, pulling Sophie closer. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that. I know I left once before, and I'm sorrier about that than you could ever imagine. But I'm here now, and I'm staying. Forever." "Really forever?" Sophie asked, her voice small. "Really forever," Victoria confirmed. "You're stuck with me now." Sophie giggled, the sound like music in the quiet room. "Good. I like being stuck with you." As they tucked Sophie back into bed, Victoria felt a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced before. This was where she belonged, in this small house with its lived-in furniture and walls covered in children's artwork, with this man who'd raised her daughter with such love and patience, with this incredible child who'd forgiven her so completely. "Sweet dreams, my love," Victoria whispered as she kissed Sophie's forehead. "Sweet dreams, Mom," Sophie replied sleepily. "I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. More than all the stars in the sky." Later, as Victoria settled into the guest bedroom that was slowly becoming her room, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been Victoria Hale, corporate titan, isolated in her ivory tower of success. Tonight, she was simply Victoria Sophie's mom, part of a family home in a way she'd never been before. Her phone buzzed with urgent messages from the corporate world she'd left behind, but Victoria didn't even glance at them. Let the vultures circle. Let the stock price fluctuate. Let the board panic about quarterly projections and market share. She had more important things to focus on now. Through the thin walls, she could hear Ethan moving around in his room, getting ready for bed. The sounds of domestic life that she was slowly learning to be part of. Tomorrow they would begin the complex process of legally establishing her parental rights, of figuring out how to blend their lives into something that worked for all of them. There would be challenges, adjustments, moments of uncertainty and fear. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Victoria Hale fell asleep, knowing that her daughter was safe and loved just down the hall, that she was part of something bigger than herself, that she had finally found what money could never buy. The corporate empire she'd spent 20 years building would survive without her constant attention. But this family, this precious, perfect, complicated family, needed her to be present, to be real, to choose love over fear every single day. And for the first time in her life, Victoria knew without a doubt that she was making the right choice. The morning brought new challenges as Victoria faced the reality of truly stepping away from her corporate life. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, with calls from board members, major investors, and media outlets trying to get the story behind her sudden disappearance from the business world. "Mom, your phone is making a lot of noise," Sophie observed over breakfast, using the title with the easy familiarity of a child who'd already adjusted to her new reality. "It is," Victoria agreed, turning the phone face down on the counter. "Some people are having trouble understanding that there are more important things than business meetings. Like family pancake breakfasts," Sophie said solemnly, cutting her pancakes into precise triangles. "Exactly like family pancake breakfasts." Ethan looked up from his coffee with concern. "Victoria, are you sure you're ready to handle the fallout from all this? It sounds like there's a lot of pressure from your company." Victoria considered the question as she watched Sophie methodically eat her triangular pancakes, marveling at the way her daughter's mind worked. 7 years of missed observations of not knowing whether Sophie was a picky eater or preferred patterns in her food, or had strong opinions about breakfast geometry. "The company will survive," Victoria said finally. "They're panicking because I've never stepped away before, but I have good people in place. Sarah Chen is brilliant. She'll make an excellent CEO. Maybe better than I was, because she won't sacrifice everything else for the sake of profit margins." "But what about your legacy, everything you built?" Victoria smiled, reaching across the table to ruffle Sophie's hair. "My legacy is sitting right here. Everything else is just money and power, and what's the point of having either if you don't have anyone to share it with?" The doorbell rang before Ethan could respond, and they all froze. Through the window, Victoria could see another black sedan in the driveway, along with what looked like a news van parked across the street. "Vultures," Victoria muttered under her breath. "What's vultures?" Sophie asked with interest. "Birds that circle around when they think something is dying," Ethan explained. "But in this case, your mom means reporters who are trying to find out why she's not at work." Sophie's eyes widened. "Are they going to try to take Mom away?" "No one is taking anyone away," Victoria said firmly, standing up with the commanding presence that had once intimidated corporate boardrooms. "I'll handle this." She opened the front door to find Agent Marcus standing on the porch, flanked by 2 other men in expensive suits. Behind them, Victoria could see a woman with a camera crew trying to get a clear shot of the house. "Ms. Hale," Marcus began, "I'm afraid the situation has escalated. The Wall Street Journal is running a story about your disappearance, and there are rumors about everything from a nervous breakdown to hostile takeover attempts. The board is demanding your immediate return." "Then the board is going to be disappointed," Victoria replied coolly. "I've made my position clear. Sarah Chen is interim CEO, and she has my full authority to make operational decisions. Ma'am, with respect, the markets don't respond well to uncertainty. Your personal brand is tied to the company's value. Then maybe it's time for the company to stand on its own merits, rather than on one person's reputation." Victoria interrupted. "I built Hale Industries to be stronger than any individual, including me." One of the other suited men stepped forward. "Ms. Hale, I'm Robert Harrison, from the Board of Directors. We need to discuss the legal implications of your absence. There are fiduciary responsibilities, contractual obligations, all of which can be handled remotely or delegated to qualified personnel," Victoria said. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but my priorities have shifted. I'm not abandoning my responsibilities, but I am restructuring them. Is it true that you've discovered you have a child?" The question came from the reporter who had somehow gotten past the suits and was now shoving a microphone toward Victoria's face. Victoria felt a surge of protective fury. The one thing she would not tolerate was her daughter being turned into a media circus. "This conversation is over," she said firmly, stepping back into the house and closing the door. Through the window, she could see the reporter gesturing excitedly to her camera operator. "Mom, why are those people trying to talk to you?" Sophie asked, her face pressed against the living room window. "Because some people think that work is more important than family," Victoria explained, sitting beside Sophie on the couch. "They don't understand that I've found something better than any job." "Are you going to go back to work?" Sophie's voice was small, and Victoria could hear the fear beneath the question. "I'm going to work differently," Victoria said carefully. "I'll probably have to travel sometimes for important meetings, and I'll need to spend some time on my computer taking care of business. But I'm never going back to the way things were before, where work was all I had. Now I have you and Daddy, and that's more important than anything else." Ethan had been listening to this exchange with a thoughtful expression. Victoria, maybe you should consider meeting with them. Not to go back, but to set clear boundaries about what your new role will be. Victoria nodded slowly. You're right. I can't just disappear without explanation. But I'm not having this conversation with Sophie here, and I'm certainly not doing it with reporters lurking around. What if we went somewhere else for the day? Ethan suggested. Let you handle your business without worrying about us overhearing corporate drama. Where would we go? Sophie asked, perking up at the suggestion of an adventure. Well, Ethan said thoughtfully. Didn't you mention wanting to see where your mom works? Maybe it's time for a field trip to the city. Victoria's first instinct was to say no to keep Sophie away from the corporate world that had consumed so much of her life. But then she realized that Sophie deserved to understand all parts of her mother's life, to see where Victoria came from and why she'd made the choices she had. Would you like that, sweetheart? Victoria asked. Would you like to see where Mommy used to spend all her time? Sophie nodded eagerly. Can we see your office and the big building? And maybe meet the people who work for you? We can do all of that, Victoria promised. But first I need to have some serious conversations with some very serious people. Boring adult stuff. I like serious adult stuff, Sophie declared. It makes me feel important. An hour later, they were in Victoria's private car. She'd finally dismissed the corporate security detail, tired of feeling like a prisoner of her own success, driving toward the city. Victoria found herself pointing out landmarks to Sophie, seeing the familiar route through her daughter's eyes. That's where I went to college, she said, as they passed the university campus. And that tall building there, that's where I had my first job after graduation. Were you scared when you started working? Sophie asked. Terrified, Victoria admitted. I was 22 years old and felt like I was pretending to be a grown-up. That's how I feel sometimes at school, Sophie confided. Like I'm pretending to be as smart as the other kids. Victoria felt her heart clench at the vulnerability in her daughter's voice. Sweetheart, you are smart. You're one of the smartest, most amazing kids I've ever met. And you know what? All those other kids are probably pretending too. Growing up is mostly about learning how to pretend you know what you're doing until you actually figure it out. Is that what you did with your company? Sophie asked. Pretty much. Victoria laughed. I pretended to be confident and capable until one day I realized I actually was. The Hale Industries Tower dominated the city skyline, 60 floors of glass and steel that represented 20 years of Victoria's life. As they pulled into the executive parking garage, Victoria felt a strange detachment from the building that had once been her entire world. Wow, Sophie breathed, craning her neck to see the top of the building. You own all of this. I built all of this, Victoria corrected gently. With a lot of help from a lot of very talented people. But yes, it's mine. The executive elevator whisked them to the 60th floor, where Victoria's corner office commanded a panoramic view of the city. Sophie pressed her nose against the floor-to-ceiling windows, marveling at the world spread out below them. You can see everything from up here, Sophie said in wonder. It's like being a giant. Sometimes it felt like that, Victoria agreed. Sometimes it felt like I was separate from everything else, looking down at a world I wasn't really part of. Victoria's assistant, a sharp young woman named Jennifer, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. Ms. Hale, thank God you're here. The phone hasn't stopped ringing, and the board is in emergency session in conference room A. Mr. Harrison has been demanding to speak with you every hour on the hour. Tell Mr. Harrison I'll meet with the board in 30 minutes, Victoria said calmly. And Jennifer. This is my daughter, Sophie. Sophie, this is Jennifer, who keeps my entire life organized. Jennifer's eyes widened as she took in Sophie's resemblance to Victoria. Your daughter, I didn't know. Congratulations, Ms. Hale. It's a recent development, Victoria said with a smile. Jennifer, could you arrange for someone to give Sophie and her father a tour of the building while I handle the board meeting? Maybe show them the executive dining room, the tech labs, the art collection. Of course, Ms. Hale. I'd be happy to arrange that. As Jennifer led Ethan and Sophie away for their tour, Victoria felt a moment of panic. She was about to face the corporate vultures who wanted to drag her back into her old life, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist if they applied enough pressure. But then she remembered the feel of Sophie's small hand in hers, the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing through the house that had become home, the way Ethan looked at her like she was more than just a corporate success story. She remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere, to be needed for who she was, rather than what she could produce. The boardroom was exactly as she remembered, an intimidating space designed to make difficult decisions and uncomfortable conversations. The 12 members of Hale Industries' board of directors were arranged around the massive conference table like a tribunal, their faces grim with corporate concern. Victoria, Robert Harrison, stood as she entered, his relief obvious. Thank God. We need to discuss your recent absence and its impact on company stability. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, the power position she'd occupied for 15 years. But something felt different now. The authority that had once flowed naturally from this chair now felt artificial, performative. Gentlemen, she began, using the commanding tone that had once made grown men tremble. I appreciate your concern, but I want to make something very clear. My absence was not a breakdown, a crisis, or a sign of instability. It was a choice to prioritize my family over corporate profits. Family. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. Victoria, you don't have a family. You've never been married, never had children. That's where you're wrong, Victoria interrupted smoothly. I've recently reconnected with my daughter, whom I placed for adoption 7 years ago. My priorities have shifted accordingly. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise and concern. Victoria let them process the information, watching their corporate minds calculate the implications of her revelation. This changes everything, said Margaret Chen, the CFO. A child means different priorities, different considerations. Exactly, Victoria agreed. Which is why I'm formally stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. Sarah Chen will take over full operational control with my complete support and confidence. The room fell silent. In 20 years of ruthless corporate maneuvering, Victoria had never seen the board so completely stunned. You can't be serious, Harrison finally managed. Victoria, you are Hale Industries. The company's value is built on your reputation, your vision. Then the company needs to evolve, Victoria said firmly. I've spent 20 years building this organization to be strong and sustainable. If it can't survive and thrive without my daily micromanagement, then I've failed as a leader. But the shareholders, the investors, they're not going to understand this, protested David Walsh, the head of investor relations. Personal family matters don't trump fiduciary responsibility. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. David, are you suggesting that I should abandon my daughter for the sake of stock prices? I'm suggesting that there are ways to balance personal life with professional obligations. I tried that once, Victoria said quietly. 7 years ago, I chose professional obligations over my daughter. I gave her up because I thought building this empire was more important than being a mother. I was wrong then, and I won't be wrong again. The room was silent as the full weight of her words sank in. These were corporate warriors who understood sacrifice for success. But Victoria was describing a sacrifice that had cost her everything that actually mattered. "What exactly are you proposing?" Harrison asked carefully. "I'm proposing that Hale Industries enter a new phase of leadership. Sarah Chen has been my hand-picked successor for 3 years. She's brilliant, capable, and has the vision to take this company into the future. I'll retain my position as chairman of the board, available for major strategic decisions, but I'm done with the day-to-day operations that kept me chained to this office. And if the market reacts badly, if the stock price drops, if investors lose confidence," Victoria shrugged, "then we'll weather the storm and come out stronger. Markets fluctuate, David. They always have, they always will. But family, that's irreplaceable." Through the conference room's glass walls, Victoria could see Sophie and Ethan returning from their tour, Sophie's face bright with excitement as she chattered to Jennifer about something she'd seen. The sight filled Victoria with a warmth that no corporate victory had ever provided. "I need your answer," she said, turning back to the board. "Samon, will you support this transition, or do I need to consider more drastic measures?" "What kind of drastic measures?" Margaret asked suspiciously. "I could sell my controlling interest," Victoria said calmly. "Walk away completely and let you explain to the shareholders why the founder abandoned ship." The threat hung in the air like a sword. Victoria owned 51% of Hale Industries stock, which gave her ultimate control over major decisions. If she chose to sell, the resulting chaos would make their current concerns look insignificant. "You wouldn't," Harrison breathed. "Try me," Victoria replied. "Gentlemen, I've found something more valuable than money or power. I've found my family. I'll do whatever it takes to protect that, including destroying everything I've built if necessary." The vote was unanimous, though Victoria suspected it was motivated more by fear than genuine support. Sarah Chen would be announced as the new CEO within the week, and Victoria would begin her transition to a purely strategic role. As the board members filed out their faces, ranging from bewildered to resentful, Victoria felt a sense of liberation that she hadn't experienced since college. For the first time in 20 years, she was free to define success on her own terms. Sophie burst into the conference room like a small tornado, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, this place is amazing. Jennifer showed us the labs where they make new computers and the art gallery with paintings that cost more than houses, and the executive dining room where they have 5 different kinds of dessert every day." "Did you have a good time?" Victoria asked, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "The best time. But you know what the coolest part was?" "What?" "Jennifer told me that you started this whole company when you were just a little older than I am now. She said you had an idea, and you worked really, really hard until it became real." Victoria's throat tightened. "That's right, sweetheart. I had a dream and I chased it." "Well, now I have a dream too," Sophie announced with the serious intensity of childhood. "I want to build something amazing like you did. But I want to build it with my family, not instead of my family." Victoria pulled Sophie into a fierce hug, overwhelmed by her daughter's wisdom. "That sounds like the perfect dream, baby girl. And I promise you, whatever you decide to build, I'll be right there helping you." As they left the Hale Industries tower, Victoria felt like she was walking away from one life and into another. The corporate world would continue without her constant presence, but this precious family she'd found would grow stronger with her attention and love. The drive home was filled with Sophie's excited chatter about everything she'd seen, her plans for her own future empire that would somehow include art and science, and making sure nobody ever has to choose between work and family. "She's going to change the world," Ethan said quietly, as Sophie dozed in the back seat, exhausted by the day's adventures. She already has, Victoria replied, watching her daughter's peaceful face in the rearview mirror. She changed mine. 3 months had passed since Victoria Hale had walked away from her corporate empire, and the small house that had once seemed impossibly cramped to someone accustomed to penthouse living now felt like the center of the universe. The autumn leaves were painting the neighborhood in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and Victoria found herself marveling at how much her life had changed with the seasons. She stood at the kitchen window watching Sophie and Ethan rake leaves in the backyard while Mrs. Henderson supervised from her lawn chair, offering commentary and occasional direction. The domestic scene still took Victoria's breath away, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so beautifully, perfectly ordinary. "Mom," Sophie called from the yard, waving enthusiastically. "Come help us. We're making the biggest leaf pile in the history of the world." Victoria smiled, wiping her hands on the dish towel. 6 months ago, if someone had told her she'd be drying dishes by hand and getting excited about leaf piles, she would have laughed at the absurdity. Now she couldn't imagine anything more important than answering her daughter's call. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been challenges: Sophie's confusion about having two parents, suddenly Ethan's struggle with sharing parental authority, Victoria's own learning curve about everything from school pickup schedules to the proper way to make a peanut butter sandwich. But they'd navigated each obstacle together, building something stronger with every small victory and minor setback. The key, Victoria had learned from Mrs. Henderson, is not trying to make up for lost time all at once. You can't compress 7 years of parenting into 7 weeks. You just have to be present for each day as it comes. The advice had proven invaluable as Victoria learned to find joy in the mundane moments that made up family life. Sophie's bedtime stories, homework sessions at the kitchen table, Saturday morning cartoons that turned into impromptu dance parties, these were the treasures that no amount of money could have purchased. Outside, Ethan looked up from his raking and caught Victoria's eye through the window. The smile he gave her was warm and intimate, filled with the kind of easy affection that had been growing between them as naturally as the changing seasons. They hadn't rushed into anything, both were too aware of Sophie's need for stability. But the connection between them had deepened with each shared responsibility, each quiet conversation after Sophie was asleep, each moment when their hands brushed while passing dishes or helping with homework. Victoria stepped into the crisp autumn air, immediately enveloped by Sophie's enthusiastic hug. "Mom, you have to see this. It's going to be the most epic leaf pile ever." "Epic indeed," Victoria agreed, surveying the impressive mound of leaves that Ethan had been systematically building. "Are you planning to jump in it?" "We're all going to jump in it," Sophie declared. "Even Mrs. Henderson said she might try it, if we make it soft enough." "I said no such thing," Mrs. Henderson protested from her chair, but Victoria could see the twinkle in her eyes. The elderly woman had become like a grandmother to Sophie, and a treasured friend to Victoria, offering wisdom and support as they navigated their unconventional family structure. As they worked together to perfect the leaf pile, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, who had proven to be every bit as capable a CEO as Victoria had predicted. The company's stock price had not only recovered from the initial shock of Victoria's departure, but had actually reached new highs under Sarah's leadership. The merger with Yamamoto Industries closed successfully, the text read. Board meeting went smoothly. Stock up 3% in after-hours trading. Hope you're enjoying your Saturday. Victoria smiled, typing back a quick congratulations before tucking the phone away. There had been a time when such news would have consumed her thoughts for the rest of the day, when she would have immediately called emergency meetings to discuss implications and next steps. Now it was simply good news from a world that continued to function perfectly well without her constant oversight. Work? Ethan asked, noticing her brief distraction. Good news, Victoria replied. The company's doing well without me micromanaging every decision. Imagine that. I can't imagine, Ethan teased. A successful business that doesn't require its founder to work 18-hour days, revolutionary concept. Victoria laughed, tackling him playfully, and sending them both tumbling into the leaf pile, much to Sophie's delight. As they emerged covered in autumn debris, Victoria caught Ethan's hand and felt that familiar flutter of warmth that had been growing stronger each day. They'd been taking things slowly, both aware of the complexity of their situation. Victoria was Sophie's biological mother, but Ethan was the parent who'd done the actual work of raising her. Their relationship had to be built on more than just shared love for Sophie. It had to be something real and lasting that could weather the inevitable challenges of blending their lives. But lying in the leaves with his fingers intertwined with hers, Victoria felt a certainty that had nothing to do with DNA tests or corporate mergers. This was right. This man who'd given her daughter everything she couldn't, who'd taught Sophie to see love in abandonment rather than rejection, who'd welcomed Victoria into their lives with such grace and generosity, he was her future. They were her future. Ethan, she began, but was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Victoria tensed instinctively, her corporate survival instincts still alert to unexpected visitors. But Ethan was smiling, checking his watch with satisfaction. Right on time, he said, climbing out of the leaf pile and offering Victoria his hand. Right on time for what? Victoria asked, suddenly aware that something was happening that she wasn't privy to. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement, bouncing on her toes, as a familiar figure emerged from the car. Victoria's breath caught as she recognized Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the family counselor they'd been seeing to help navigate their unique situation. Dr. Hendricks, Victoria said, confusion evident in her voice. I thought our next appointment wasn't until Tuesday. It's not, Dr. Hendricks replied with a warm smile. I'm here for something else entirely. Something I think you're going to enjoy very much. Ethan was grinning now, and even Mrs. Henderson looked suspiciously pleased with herself. Victoria felt like she was missing a crucial piece of information. What's going on? She asked, looking between the three adults and one very excited 7-year-old. Mom, Sophie said, taking Victoria's hand with the serious expression she wore when something was particularly important. We need to talk to you about something. Something really, really important. They moved into the living room where Victoria noticed several official-looking documents spread across the coffee table. Dr. Hendricks settled into her usual chair, while Ethan guided Victoria to the couch, with Sophie between them. Victoria, Dr. Hendricks began. Over the past 3 months, I've had the privilege of watching your family come together in truly remarkable ways. The love, the commitment, the genuine care you all show for each other, it's been extraordinary to witness. Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety. Is something wrong? Have we been doing something? Nothing's wrong, Ethan said quickly, squeezing her hand. Just the opposite, actually. Sophie could barely contain her excitement any longer. Mom, do you remember when you first came here and I drew that picture of our family? Of course, sweetheart, I still have it. Well, I've been thinking about that picture a lot, and I realized something important. Sophie's voice took on the solemn tone she used for her deepest thoughts. That picture showed what I wanted our family to be, but it wasn't official yet. Victoria looked around the room, still not understanding where this was heading. Official. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward with a gentle smile. Victoria, Sophie has something she'd like to ask you. Something very important. Sophie stood up and moved to stand directly in front of Victoria, her small hands clasped behind her back, in a gesture that reminded Victoria painfully of herself at that age. "Mom." Sophie began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I know you're my birth mommy, and that's really special. But I want more than that. I want you to be my real mommy too, legally and officially and forever." Victoria's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Sophie, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to adopt me," Sophie announced with the gravity of someone making a momentous decision. "I want Daddy to adopt you as my mommy so that you'll always be my parents and I'll always be your daughter no matter what." The words hit Victoria like a physical force. Adoption. Sophie wanted her to officially adopt the daughter she'd given birth to 7 years ago. The beautiful, perfect circularity of it made Victoria's head spin. "But sweetheart," Victoria managed through her tears, "I'm already your mother. You don't need to be adopted by your birth mother." "Actually," Dr. Hendricks interjected gently, "that's not quite accurate. Legally, when Sophie was placed for adoption, Victoria's parental rights were terminated. Ethan has sole legal custody. For Victoria to have official parental rights, she would indeed need to adopt Sophie." Victoria looked at Ethan, who was watching her with an expression of hopeful anticipation. "You knew about this. Sophie came to me with the idea 6 weeks ago," he admitted. "She'd been thinking about it ever since that first DNA test, trying to figure out how to make our family official, as she put it. We've been working with Dr. Hendricks to make sure we handled everything properly." "And you're okay with this, with sharing legal custody?" Ethan's smile was radiant. "Victoria, you've been sharing the actual work of parenting for 3 months. Making it legal is just catching up with reality." Sophie climbed back onto the couch, nestling between them with the satisfied air of someone whose plan was coming together perfectly. "Besides, I already checked, and there's something else we need to talk about." "Something else?" Victoria asked weakly, not sure how many more surprises her heart could handle. Sophie nodded seriously. "If you adopt me, then you and Daddy will both be my legal parents. But you won't be legal parents to each other. So I think you should fix that too." Victoria felt the world tilt on its axis as Sophie's meaning became clear. She looked at Ethan, who had gone very still beside her. "Sophie," Ethan said carefully, "what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if we're going to be a real family, we should do it all the way," Sophie replied with the unshakable logic of childhood. "You and Mom should get married so that we're all connected to each other legally and officially and forever." The silence that followed was profound. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of Sophie's expectant gaze, could sense Ethan's careful stillness as he waited for her reaction. "Sweetheart," Victoria said finally, "marriage is something that adults decide between themselves. It's not just about being a family." "But don't you love each other?" Sophie interrupted with typical 7-year-old directness. "Because it seems like you do. You look at each other the way people do in movies when they're about to kiss." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks as she glanced at Ethan, who looked equally flustered. Dr. Hendricks was trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "Sophie," Ethan began, but she was on a roll now. "I mean, I know you love each other because of me, but I think you love each other because of each other too. And Mrs. Henderson says that when grown-ups love each other and want to be a family, they should make it official so everyone knows they're serious." "Mrs. Henderson says a lot of things," Victoria muttered, shooting a look at the elderly woman, who was suddenly very interested in organizing Sophie's art supplies. "But she's usually right," Sophie pointed out reasonably. "And I think she's right about this too. I think you should marry each other and adopt me, and then we'll be the most official family ever." Dr. Hendricks cleared her throat gently. Perhaps this would be a good time for the adults to have a private conversation, she suggested. Sophie, why don't you show me that new drawing you've been working on? As Sophie led Dr. Hendricks toward her art corner, chattering excitedly about her latest masterpiece, Victoria found herself alone with Ethan and the weight of everything that had just been said. I'm sorry, Ethan said immediately. I had no idea she was going to bring up the other thing. The adoption was her idea, and I thought it was beautiful, but the marriage thing, did you put her up to it? Victoria asked quietly. God, no, Ethan replied emphatically. Victoria, I would never use Sophie to pressure you into anything. I wouldn't do that. Victoria studied his face, seeing only sincerity and a hint of panic. But do you think she's wrong about us? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Victoria and Sophie, who was enthusiastically explaining her artwork to Dr. Hendricks. I think, he said carefully, that Sophie is a very perceptive little girl who sees things that adults sometimes try to ignore. What kinds of things? The way you hum while you're making breakfast. The way I find excuses to help you with things you're perfectly capable of doing yourself. The way we both watch for each other's reactions when Sophie does something funny. Ethan's voice was soft, intimate. The way it feels natural to reach for your hand, or the way you fit perfectly against my side when we're reading to Sophie. Victoria felt her heart racing as he voiced all the small intimacies she'd been noticing but hadn't dared to name. Ethan, she whispered, what are you saying? I'm saying that our 7-year-old daughter might be smarter than both of us combined, he replied with a rueful smile. I'm saying that I've been falling in love with you since the night you helped me make dinner and somehow made our broken little family feel complete. The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest and terrifying in their simplicity. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked at this man who'd given her daughter everything she couldn't, who'd somehow made room in their lives for the mother who'd abandoned them, who was offering her a love she'd never believed she deserved. I love you too, she whispered the words, feeling both foreign and inevitable. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw how much you love our daughter. And then I fell deeper when I realized you were making room to love me too. Ethan's smile was radiant as he reached for her hands. So what do we do about it? Before Victoria could answer, Sophie's voice piped up from across the room. You could start by kissing each other, she suggested helpfully. That's what people do in movies when they figure out they love each other. Victoria and Ethan both laughed, the tension breaking as they remembered their audience. But when Ethan's eyes met hers again, Victoria saw her own feelings reflected there: love, hope, the recognition that they'd found something rare and precious that was worth fighting for. Sophie's right about one thing, Victoria said softly. If we're going to do this, we should do it all the way. All the way. Victoria took a deep breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into the unknown. The adoption papers, yes. I want to officially be Sophie's mother in every possible way. But the other thing too, eventually. When we're ready, when we're sure. Are you proposing to me, Victoria Hale? Ethan asked with a grin. I'm saying, I'm open to the possibility of being proposed to, Victoria replied primly. By the right person, at the right time, in the right way. Good to know, Ethan murmured, and then he was kissing her soft and sweet and full of promise, while Sophie cheered in the background and Dr. Hendricks pretended not to watch. When they broke apart, Victoria felt like the last piece of a puzzle had finally clicked into place. This was her family, chaotic and unconventional and absolutely perfect. So, Dr. Hendricks said with professional calm, as if she hadn't just witnessed a major romantic breakthrough, shall we discuss the adoption paperwork? The next hour was spent reviewing legal documents and timelines, discussing the process that would make Victoria officially Sophie's adoptive mother. It would take several months to complete, involving home studies and court appearances and mountains of paperwork, but Dr. Hendricks assured them that given the unique circumstances, there were unlikely to be any significant obstacles. The courts generally favor keeping families together, she explained, and it's clear that this arrangement is in Sophie's best interests. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria found herself marveling at how naturally everything was falling into place. The adoption process that had once seemed impossibly complex was simply a series of steps to be completed. The corporate empire she'd thought would collapse without her was thriving under new leadership. The love she'd been afraid to acknowledge was being returned with interest. When Dr. Hendricks finally left armed with signed documents and a timeline for the next steps, the small family found themselves alone in the golden light of late afternoon. Sophie was sprawled on the living room floor, working on a new drawing that appeared to feature stick figures in wedding attire. "Subtle," Ethan observed, looking over her shoulder. "I like to plan ahead," Sophie replied without looking up. "Mrs. Henderson says that's a good quality in a person." "Mrs. Henderson says a lot of things," Victoria repeated, but she was smiling as she said it. As evening approached, they settled into their routine of dinner preparation, homework help, and bedtime stories. But everything felt different now, charged with new possibility and official recognition of what they'd already become. During Sophie's bath time, Victoria found herself standing in the doorway, watching Ethan help their daughter wash her hair, marveling at the gentle competence that came from 7 years of single parenting. In a few months, Sophie would legally be her daughter too, but Victoria had already learned that love made its own laws, created its own bonds that were stronger than any legal document. "Mom," Sophie called from the bathtub, "when I'm adopted, will my name change?" Victoria and Ethan exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed the name question yet. "What would you like your name to be, sweetheart?" Victoria asked. Sophie considered this with the serious attention she gave all important decisions. "Well, I'm Sophie Carter now because that's Daddy's name. But if you adopt me, maybe I could be Sophie Carter Hale, so I have both your names." Victoria felt her throat close up at the suggestion. Sophie Carter Hale, their daughter officially and legally and forever, carrying both their names as proof of the love that had brought them together. "I think that's a beautiful name," Victoria managed. "The most beautiful name in the world," Ethan agreed, his voice rough with emotion. As they tucked Sophie into bed that night, Victoria felt the profound contentment of someone who'd finally found their place in the world. This small bedroom, with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in children's artwork, was more valuable than any corner office, any penthouse view, any corporate achievement she'd ever accomplished. "Sweet dreams, Sophie Carter Hale," Victoria whispered, testing the name on her tongue. "Sweet dreams, Mom," Sophie replied sleepily. "Thank you for coming home to us." Later, as Victoria and Ethan sat on the front porch in the cool evening air, Victoria reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been Victoria Hale, corporate titan, isolated in her ivory tower of success. Tonight, she was simply Victoria, Sophie's mom, Ethan's partner, part of a family that had welcomed her home without question or condition. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Victoria considered the question seriously. She thought about the corporate empire she'd stepped away from, the wealth and power that had once defined her worth, the life of isolation and achievement that had seemed so important just months ago. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "I spent 20 years building something that could survive without me. But this family we're building, This requires me to be present, to be real, to show up every single day. And that's exactly where I want to be." Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of two people who'd found their way home to each other. "I love you, Victoria Hale," he said softly. "I love you too, Ethan Carter," she replied. "And I love the family we're building together." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had watched over Victoria during her years of corporate success and isolation. The same stars that had witnessed Ethan's journey as a single father. The same stars that now blessed their improbable love story with the light of infinite possibility. In the house behind them, Sophie slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of adoption papers and wedding dresses and families that chose each other across time and circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of ordinary magic that made up the fabric of family life. But tonight, three hearts beat in rhythm with the knowledge that love really could conquer all, that broken things could be mended. That sometimes the most important journeys brought you home to people you'd never stopped missing, even when you'd never met them before. The storm that had brought Victoria to their door seemed like a lifetime ago, but she knew now that it hadn't been a coincidence. It had been destiny, fate, the universe conspiring to heal a family that had been broken before it was ever whole. The single father and his daughter, who'd stopped to help a stranded woman, had saved more than just Victoria from the storm. They'd saved her from a life of hollow achievement and emotional isolation. And Victoria Hale, who had built an empire on other people's failures, had finally learned what success actually looked like. It looked like pancake breakfasts and homework sessions and bedtime stories. It looked like choosing love over fear, family over profit, presence over power. It looked like coming home to people who saw her not as a corporate success story, but as simply Victoria Sophie's mom, Ethan's love, the missing piece that made their family complete. As they sat together in the gentle darkness, planning adoption ceremonies and discussing the possibility of future weddings, Victoria knew that this was the happy ending she'd never dared to dream possible. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. The little house that had once seemed impossibly small now felt infinite with possibility. And Victoria Hale, who had once measured her worth in stock prices and market share, now measured it in the sound of her daughter's laughter, the warmth of her partner's embrace, and the profound joy of finally truly coming home. In 6 months, Sophie would officially become Sophie Carter Hale, adopted daughter of Victoria Hale and Ethan Carter. In a year, if the stars aligned and hearts stayed true, Victoria and Ethan might exchange vows of their own making, official what was already written in their souls. But tonight, under the canopy of ancient stars and infinite love, they were already everything they needed to be a family born not of blood or law, but of choice and love and the simple recognition that some things were meant to be. The storm had passed, the dawn had come, and Victoria Hale had finally found her way home.